Quickly, the ground rules. After each candidate gives a 1-minute opening statement, I will ask the first in a series of questions to the candidates. They will each have 1 minute to answer the question, and then I will follow up with 1, 2, or all 3 of the candidates. We rolled the dice and determined that we will start with Senator Dayton, followed by Mr. Horner, followed by Representative Emmer. Senator Dayton, your opening statement.
Thank you, Professor Pearson. Thank you all for being here. I'm delighted to be joined by my son, Andrew Dayton, who's a third-year law student at the University of Minnesota. Unfortunately, he was disqualified as one of the questioners for Representative Emmer and Mr. Horner. It's appropriate that we're here at the university because higher education throughout Minnesota is so important to the future of our state. And yet, Minnesota dropped from being the 12th highest state among the nations in its expenditures for higher education in 2001 to 35th place among the states in 2009. Our commitment to higher education as to other aspects of public education in Minnesota has fallen, and that's one of the reasons that the tuition here at the U has doubled in real dollars over the past decade, making it unaffordable for far too many Minnesota families and their sons and daughters. There's something wrong when our own working Minnesota families cannot afford to send their own children to our public university. If I'm governor, I'll work to make tuition more affordable for you and others to follow you.
Thank you, Senator Dayton. Mr. Horner.
Well, thank you very much. And I do think that it's appropriate that we have this debate among the many that we've held at the university. Because in so many ways, this really is an election about the future, about your future. And I think the fundamental question of this election is, do we invest, do we stake our future on narrow partisan solutions? One of which says, let's just cut spending and everything will be resolved that way. The other which says, let's just tax 4% of the population and everybody else gets a free ride. Those are solutions that look in the rearview mirror. We need to look to the future, to your future. Minnesota is a terrific state, a state of great strengths, great opportunities, great assets. Now we need the leadership that matches it. So I appreciate this opportunity, and I'm looking forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Horner. Representative Emmer.
Thank you, Catherine. Thanks for doing this. Thank you, Mr. Horner, Senator Dayton. Thank all of you for showing up today. This is hopefully going to be a great dialogue between the three of us and all of you so you get to know who we are and what we're about. Briefly, there are 3 people running for the office of governor in the state of Minnesota, but there are only 2 messages. On the one hand, my colleagues propose raising billions of dollars of taxes to support what we believe is an unsustainable, yet again, growth in government. We believe that it's time to look at a different direction. We believe it's time to talk about government living within its means, having it purchase the services that we all expect government to provide within the resources available, and then we got to start growing jobs again. Because after all, you cannot pay for anything that you expect government to provide if you're not growing a healthy number of new jobs in your private sector. Looking forward to the discussion today, and thanks again for having us.
Great. Thank you all. The first question, and we'll start here with Mr. Horner. The next governor will have the immediate responsibility of presenting a budget that addresses the anticipated deficit that approaches $6 billion over the next 2 years. You have each presented your plans in many other venues. Now, please identify the specific components of your opponent's proposals that you would not support as governor and explain why.
And I'm sorry, is that to me?
Yes, yes.
I'm sorry.
Yes.
Yes, I mean, I would not support Senator Dayton's proposal to increase the top rate of the income tax to what would be one of the highest rates in the country. I think it imposes a terrible burden on job creators, and if we tax the job creators, we're taxing away jobs. And Senator Dayton talks frequently about DigiKey in Thief River Falls, a great company, a company that has added hundreds of jobs. That's a company that would have its state tax increased by 30 to 40%. If Senator Dayton's proposal goes through, that's unacceptable. On Representative Emmer's proposal, I don't think that we can afford to cut at the level that Representative Emmer has proposed. I think he's offering too much in tax cuts that don't get to business tax reform, simply pad the bottom line. We do need business tax reform, but the first tax dollar has to be invested in incenting businesses and individuals to invest, not just in adding to the bottom line. So I think we need a more balanced approach than what Representative Emmer proposes.
Thank you, Mr. Horner. Representative Emmer.
Well, and I appreciate that, but maybe we should sit down and talk about it some more, because I've presented the only balanced budget, the only budget that actually balances in every area. My colleagues, Senator Dayton still has a $1 billion hole in his, and he's still working on it, and Mr. Horner's has a $2.5 billion hole. I mean, here's where I disagree. I disagree that we should be raising all kinds of taxes to grow government almost 17% in the next 2 years, because at some point we have to get a hold of the spending of government. Yes, government's got to provide services, but we should be able to purchase those services within available resources. And then, folks, whenever we talk about cutting, I think my colleagues should be clear about the fact we're not cutting government. In fact, our budget increases government spending in the next biennium by 7 to 8%. We believe government can live within that new 7 to 8% of revenue rather than growing it unsustainably by 17%.
Senator Dayton.
Well, I disagree with Mr. Horner's proposal to extend the sales tax to clothing and to personal services such as haircuts and car repairs, because that's the tax that falls more heavily on the middle class than on upper income taxpayers. I disagree with Representative Emmer's proposal to cut funding for higher education by 14%, cut local government aids by 1/3, and the Minnesota Department of Revenue says for every dollar that you cut in local government aids or in school aid from the state, property taxes go up by 67 cents. So that's why property taxes in Minnesota under Governor Plenty have gone from $4 billion to $7 billion. That falls most heavily on middle-income families and on small businesses. So cutting local government aids and school assistance, in addition to hurting schools and police and fire, other essential protections, means property taxes would continue to rise for working Minnesotans and their families. By contrast, I want to protect the middle class from higher taxes.
You've each presented the electorate with some pretty distinct policy positions, but we know that it would be difficult for any one of your plans to get through the legislature without some compromises. We've certainly seen that in the last biennium. Where are you willing to compromise? What parts of your opponent's proposals would you be willing to accept? If I could actually have all of you just answer that question briefly as a follow-up.
Well, I mean, part of the process, and I've been in the executive branch through 9 different legislative sessions, is give and take, and there'll be 201 legislators with different points of view from mine, and that's part of the process. So I wouldn't rule anything out to begin with. We'll get new budget forecasts both in December and then next January, February, and so this will be a moving target to begin with, and I'll work with legislators until we meet the constitutional requirement by the end of the session to balance the state budget.
Representative Emmer?
Well, first, I am the only one who has provided proposals for job creation in this state involving reduction of the corporate franchise tax, 10% exclusion on pass-through income for small businesses, expanding the research and development tax credit, expanding the angel investment tax credit to grow jobs. That Catherine actually has support from both Republicans and Democrats historically in the legislature. Senator Dayton has offered a tax the rich plan that got 7 votes in the Minnesota House of Representatives last year, and Mr. Horner has offered a sales tax plan that has very little, if any, support right now in the legislature. So first off, I have put out a plan that would draw people from both sides, and second, the only overriding message I would have for the legislature is government must live within the 7 to 8% of new revenue it's going to have to spend, and if there are different priorities that the legislature has within the line items, we're open to talk about them.
Well, and I think that really is, in a lot of ways, the critical question of this election. I think we have 2 candidates, with all due respect to my colleagues, who have put all of their investment in very narrow solutions. Senator Dayton appealing to very liberal Democrats only, Representative Emmer appealing to very conservative Republicans only. The fact of the matter is, when you look at my proposals, the chair of the Senate Tax Committee in the past session, Senator Bach, a good northeastern Minnesota Democrat, made a proposal very similar to mine. The business-led, business-appointed, Governor Pawlenty-appointed Tax Reform Commission came out and said, this is what we need to do, my proposal, the broadening the base. Because what we really need to do is reform taxes. We put too much dependence on income tax. And so my proposal, reduce the sales tax, broaden the base, has broad bipartisan support, and it's the only plan that does.
Okay. Thank you all. I'm sure we'll get back to the various budget proposals. They're such an important part of this campaign, but I want to shift the focus for a minute from Minnesota's immediate budget shortfall to focus on the next decade. What do you think are the biggest challenges facing Minnesota over the next 10 years? And what specifically would you do as governor to ensure that Minnesota meets these challenges? And here we are starting with Representative Emmer and then going to Dayton and then Horner. You each have 1 minute.
It's a great question, because I'll just point out that my colleague, Mr. Horner, nobody has agreed out of those groups you talked about that we should be doing billions of dollars in new tax increases. The biggest challenge for the next 10 years is to bring government, state government, into the 21st century. Any business, if it operated the way it did 30 years ago, 40 years ago, would not be in business today. Private businesses are constantly adapting to meet the challenges of the new day. Our state government, by comparison, still works the same way today as it did many years ago. And it's time to start looking at the various agencies that redesign our state government so that it delivers the services people expect in the most efficient, affordable, and more importantly, sustainable manner. And then the job, immediately and over the next decade, is start to grow jobs again in our private sector so that Minnesota can once again realize the opportunity that we had when we had companies like Honeywell, IBM, 3M, Univac. Red means stop?
That does.
Okay, I'll stop.
I'll give you some time to follow up, too.
We're going backwards. So when we go up, that's the end. Okay, thank you. I'm used to going down.
And I'm not even going to make a joke about that.
How did I do?
How did I do? Good straight line, nice follow.
Senator Dayton, the next 10 years.
Well, and I'm going to resist the temptation to continue our hockey defenseman versus hockey goalie.
Can you tell that we've been together a lot lately?
Well, job creation is certainly the key for Minnesota and for our nation. I've been to China 6 times this decade. I've seen many of those people willing to work very hard. That's true all over the world. The challenges that you and the audience, the students and young people are going to face in this rest of your lifetimes, far greater than we've faced in terms of economic growth for this state and nation in the last 50 years. And that's why education is so vitally important. And why it's so unfair for us to tell you that your education is important. You should get as much of it as possible as you should. It'll help you and benefit society as it will, but we're not going to help you pay for it. And the debt load we put on students and the failure to invest in education and the need to reinvest, starting with early childhood education, kindergarten through 12th grade, smaller class sizes, and higher education, making it affordable, is very much the key to Minnesota's future economic and social success.
Thank you, Mr. Horner.
So 10 years in 1 minute, let's give it a try. I think that it really does highlight the fundamental difference. When you have two candidates who are only looking in the rearview mirror to say, let's use the same solutions that have failed in the past. Let's use the same solutions that have created the political gridlock. Let's get ourselves locked into just taxing the wealthy or just cutting the spending. It's going to be very hard to create 10 years forward that are much different from 10 years in the past. I think that's what we have to decide. The challenge for us is to fundamentally change the relationship between all of us and government. And how do we reconnect all of Minnesotans back to public policy, back to decision making? If we allow 20% over here, 20% over here to control the political debate, we're going to continue to have the same problems. This is an opportunity to do something different, to elect a leader who's going to engage all Minnesotans in creative solutions, in figuring out a new relationship between us and government and among all of us together. That's our challenge, that's our opportunity.
Mr. Horner, if I could first follow up with you. Many Minnesotans, in fact, the majority of Minnesotans, identify with one of the two major parties and actually look to the parties for solutions. So could you be a little bit more specific about how you specifically would connect citizens to their government without sort of bringing people together with a pre-existing party identification?
Sure, and I think the first answer to that is, and how has it worked so far with the two parties? I mean, have we moved things forward? Have we broken through the gridlock? And so we connect, I connect, because that's what I've done in my community service career and my professional career. And I think we do it first by making sure that we have a terrific cabinet. I mean, Governor Ventura, who was very successful in his first 2 years, did it in part because he had a great cabinet, and I think that's the first step. But the second step is that you can't rest solutions. You can't build solutions only in the Democratic and Republican parties. We have to have a governor who can talk over the heads of the legislature, who can engage the public, who's willing to bring the public, who's going to listen to the public. That's what I've done in my whole career. I think it is the only way that we're going to move Minnesota forward.
Thank you. Representative Emmer, if I could follow up on your answer, can you be more specific about the role of the state government in advancing economic growth and job creation?
Absolutely. But I think the way I'll start it after listening to my colleague is really this, in Catherine, your questions. This election really isn't about being a Republican or a Democrat or an independent. It's about common sense. And you can't just make promises to everybody about everything. Mr. Horner, you've actually said you're going to protect 85% of what government says it wants to grow, the 17%. You've got a $2.5 billion hole in your budget. You can't promise everything to everybody and then not deliver. What we're talking about is government will have about 7 to 8% more, $3 billion almost more to spend in the next biennium. You got to make sure that it lives within its means, and then when you do the tax stimulation stuff, or the tax incentive things that we talked about, the corporate franchise tax will put roughly $360 million in the hands of businesses to start hiring and making capital purchases in the next 2 years. The 10% exclusion on small business will give small business owners about $160 million in the next 2 years to hire, and I can go on, but I see I'm done. But the idea is to start getting them to hire new people like the people in this room.
And Senator Dayton, if I could ask you the same question, you focused on the role of higher education in growing the economy, and that's certainly important. How else can the government play a role?
Well, I served twice as Minnesota's Commissioner of Economic Development, and we provided incentives for businesses, particularly manufacturing businesses, to locate or expand in Minnesota. That was successful in producing jobs. I proposed moving up to next January a $1 billion bonding bill, taking advantage of low interest rates. One study is that such a bill would finance 28,000 jobs in the construction industry and among the building trades in Minnesota, where we have high unemployment. I have proposed a green energy savings fund, modeled after the University of Minnesota Morris, where they've retrofitted the buildings for more efficient energy use. That puts people to work in there. Also retrofit the heating and cooling systems to use alternative energy. We can lower the cost of energy for taxpayers and save those dollars, as well as develop an alternative energy industry in Minnesota, which is going to be the energy future of our state, and put people to work in that industry for decades to come.
Thank you. Now, shifting to our third question, each of you will have 1 minute to respond to start with. We'll start with Senator Dayton here. Rapidly rising health care costs comprise a growing share of the budget and also make it difficult for many in Minnesota to afford health care. What would you do as governor to prevent health care costs from crowding out the rest of the budget while still ensuring that Minnesotans have quality health care?
Well, the first thing I would do on January 1st, if I'm governor, is sign the early opt-in for Medicaid. There's $188 million additional state spending over 3 years, which has already been included in the budget for the next biennium by the current governor and legislature. And that would bring in $1.4 billion, minus what Governor Plenty has forsaken up till January 1st, which is almost $1 billion a day, terribly unfortunate. And that would provide health insurance for about 102,000 Minnesotans, the poorest of the poor. And also, very importantly, it would provide the financial security to Minnesota hospitals all over the state so that they can provide the quality care they do for all of our citizens. Beyond that, we need to look at this as an entire society. The cost of health insurance and the cost of health care, even for those who has insurance, as you said, is just making both unaffordable for increasing numbers of Minnesotans. And also, so as a result, in part, many of the 50,000 Minnesotans have gone from private insurance to public rolls over the last year, and that also drives up the cost.
Thank you. Mr. Horner.
Well, I think this is exactly an area where we need to be innovative. We need to be bold, and yet we get the same tired answers of either go to a single payer, as Senator Dayton has said, or change to a voucher system, a charity care system. I don't think either of those are going to work. We do need to build on what is working in Minnesota. We ought to go to the early opt-in, as Senator Dayton suggested, but those aren't the only answers. We need to figure out how do we drive health care reform at the community level. How do we engage people? So a good example, the Department of Health decided that it would help kids from low-income families who have asthma, one of the great drivers of emergency room use. They got involved in fixing some of the upstream issues, helping parents deal with some of the triggers. In the end, they were able to reduce the emergency room use, reduce health care costs by an average of $2,000 per child per year, but more than that, they were able to reduce school absences by an average of 7 days per year. That's the achievement gap, keeping those kids in school, keeping them healthy, reducing our health care costs.
Representative Emmer.
Catherine, this is a much more complicated situation that would take a minute, but very quickly, some things that we could do right away and we should do. One, decouple our health insurance coverage from employment. Give individuals the same opportunity to deduct their health care insurance premiums that we only give to employers right now. Two, we need to create more pooling options, not just with people that might be same or similarly situated, but with greater groups of people. And we've got to give choice to folks to start working with one of the 3,000 to 4,000 professional insurance brokers that we have in this state to tailor coverage to meet their needs. And then third or fourth, depending on whether you thought that was two ideas in one, you got to give people the opportunity to shop one of the 1,300 approved health insurance products across this country. You give people more ownership over their health care, you give them more of an opportunity, they will take that opportunity and it will drive down costs. How do we know? Well, LASIK surgery came in the mid-90s. LASIK surgery was very expensive. It's not a mandated coverage. It's something where people have to compete. Today, you can find LASIK surgery for about $450.
Representative Emmer, if I could follow up with you. Should Minnesota work with the federal government on the new health care plan, or should Minnesota resist it?
Well, I think we're going to find out after November 2nd what the status is at the federal level. I don't think you ever say that you're not going to work with the federal government, but that plan, they're just finding out how serious it is and what the consequences are. I think you're going to see some major changes in it. In the meantime, we've got to look at these ideas that I've talked about at a state level. We have the best quality health care offered ever in the world here in Minnesota. There's a reason why people fly into Minnesota to access the great Mayo Clinic and other providers we have in this state. We also have access, as you've heard, if people go to an emergency room, they're going to get treated. But we all agree that's not the best delivery system for health care. It's the most expensive. So the idea is doing some of these reforms so we can actually create some market forces to drive costs down to create better access.
Mr. Horner and Senator Dayton, if you want to follow up just briefly on this question of working with the federal government on health care reform.
Well, I do think we need to work with the federal government. We need to figure out how to leverage that for lower cost, higher quality care in Minnesota. And I think we've lost a number of opportunities. Representative Emmer talks about a competitive marketplace. Well, you know, just bringing in a lot more insurance companies doesn't reduce prices. Look at North Dakota has the lowest per person, per member cost in the country. It essentially has one insurance company. Now, that's not the answer, but neither is opening the floodgates to any insurance company that wants to do business. I think we do need to look at things like the insurance exchange that the federal government has made available planning money, where Minnesota could use its expertise to make sure that we do have more choices, that we have competitive choices. You know, the reality is that I believe this is right. Every state accepted the planning money, except two, Minnesota and Alaska. And I think that speaks to the politics of the issue. We've got to get past the politics of health reform.
Thank you. Senator Dayton.
Of course, as governor, you work with the federal government, and I would say the same if it were a Republican president or a Democrat president. And it's so unfortunate that Governor Plenty has chosen to play politics with what he attributes to President Obama when Medicaid was passed when President Obama was 4 years old. And the Governor's Plenty is costing Minnesota almost $1 million a year, about $890,000, a day, by not accepting the early opt-in to Medicaid. So if we get beyond the politics, then we in state government, and Minnesota, as Mr. Horner said, has been a leader. Other states in the past have looked to Minnesota. We have one of the best healthcare systems in the country to say, how does Minnesota approach these critical problems? And we should restore that leadership position among the states. We should be working with the federal government because a lot of this is undefined, and it will depend on how the states take the various initiatives. And the goal should be to provide the best possible health care for all of our citizens, Minnesotans, and Americans at affordable cost.
Thank you. Next question turns to transportation. Transportation is an issue that affects all Minnesotans, but transportation funding decisions have different consequences in different areas of the state. Given limited resources, what would you prioritize? The expansion of multimodal transit, the repair and maintenance of existing roads and infrastructure, or the building of new roads? And here we'll start with Mr. Horner.
Well, I think that frames the question incorrectly. I mean, I don't think that it's you pick all of this or all of that. I think you have to set different outcomes, and the outcomes we need to work against are what creates the greatest economic opportunities in Minnesota. And they're going to be different answers for different needs. But we have to set priorities and then figure out how we fund those. And so the Minnesota Department of Transportation has said in the next 20 years, we will need $65 billion to maintain current capacity on highways and bridges. They've identified $15 billion. Now, the old way of doing politics, the way that we've seen in the legislature, the way we've seen with Democratic and Republican leadership in the legislature is you take $15 billion, divide it by 201, the number of legislative districts, and you do a little bit everywhere and not a lot and not very well anywhere. That's what we can't afford. And it's only, I believe, an independent who can bring all of these different interest groups together so that we can invest in transit, we can invest in a strong highway and bridge system.
Thank you. Representative Emmer.
Well, you got to look at moving people and product. That's the key. You've got to set your priorities. You're right. Today, 95% of the people in this state travel by road and bridge. We can work our tails off over the next 10 years and double transit ridership in this state, but even then, 90% of us will be traveling by road and bridge. We need to set our priorities. We need to look at every transportation option, and we need to fund those priorities. And I'll just add, going back to the last question real quick, when it comes to health care in this state, if the question would have been, do I believe in a government-run health care system? Absolutely not. These two gentlemen do. We have a fundamental disagreement, and it's not about opening up the state of Minnesota for a flood of insurance companies. It's about starting to trust you and I, the people again, to make decisions about our own health care instead of turning it over to the federal government when we don't have enough money to support it. So it's also about doing a due diligence instead of pointing the finger at Governor Paulini. You got to understand, it's going to cost this state $500 million to do the early Medicaid opt-in. And that's not responsible under the numbers we have right now.
Senator Dayton.
Well, I commend you for the question on transportation because it's seldom asked in our 24 debates so far. And it's one of the crucial issues affecting the future of Minnesota. And you talk about business climate and the importance of that, transportation to that, I'm surprised it hasn't come up. You know, if you want a real world example of what happens if government fails to make the necessary investments over the last 20 years, look at the congestion in the metropolitan area, the deterioration of our highways in greater Minnesota, and realize that if we had spent the same amount of money in real dollars over those 20 years we did in 1990, we would have spent $15 billion more, and we would be in much better shape today. Now we're seriously in arrears. And the necessity, I would put the investment into just basic repair and maintenance of our network of highways and roads and bridges and public transit, carrying that forward in the metro area. Certainly, as Representative Emmer said, for much of Minnesota, highways are essential, and continuing the maintenance of those is going to be crucial. We also need to be looking for ways where we can relieve the congestion in the metropolitan area, or it's going to stifle our economic growth and our social vitality.
Thank you all for these responses. We will now take a 3-minute break. As governor, would you support the adoption of a measure similar to Arizona's new immigration enforcement law? Why or why not? And we're starting here with Representative Emmer.
I think we've got ample laws in the state of Minnesota right now if we just enforce the laws we have. But now that you ask it, Catherine, I did say last spring that I thought the Arizona law was a good start. And a lot of people didn't get the rest of the answer. The rest of the answer is because the federal government in this country has jurisdiction over immigration, and frankly, they've completely abdicated their responsibility to secure our borders and make sure that we have an orderly inflow of legal immigrants. Let's face it, if this country ever sees a day when people do not want to come here to experience the freedom and opportunity that the United States is supposed to offer, then we've all lost. So the idea is, I thought that that law would get the federal government off the dime and start working towards solving the border problem and the inflow of legal immigrants. But so far, it seems we're continuing to see people drag their feet in Washington. And I think the next governor in this state, along with several others, has to encourage the federal government to do their job.
Thank you. Senator Dayton.
Well, I think it was a terrible start, and the federal government has the constitutional responsibility federal government has the constitutional responsibility, and I was in Washington during the time when President Bush, I think being the former governor of a border state, to his credit, was very close just before 9/11 to reach an agreement with the Congress, and then that was sent back, and then in 2005, in 2006, he took the initiative again, and bipartisan, Senator Ted Kennedy, Senator John McCain came together and was absolutely, blown apart by the right-wing ideologues. So to say that the Congress was dragging its feet, I mean, they've been, the ideology of it has been preventing those initiatives were undertaken. It does need to be a federal solution, and in reference to Arizona in particular, the former police chief of St. Paul and the police chief of Minneapolis and the current police chief of St. Paul have all said public safety, effective community policing would be seriously destructed by the approach the Arizona law has taken.
Thank you. Mr. Horner.
No, I don't think it's a good law. I never thought that it was going to be an answer, and I think it's exactly the kind of issue that traditional politicians use to drive wedges instead of bringing people together. All one needs to do is walk down Lake Street, walk down University Avenue, walk down Payne and Arcade, and see what new Minnesotans have brought to this state in terms of their entrepreneurialism, their vitality, how they're investing in those communities. Should everybody be here legally? Of course. And we certainly need to have secure borders. We certainly need to make sure that we're working with employers to make sure that they're hiring people who are documented. But we don't need to be a state that says we're going to divide some from others. We need to welcome new Minnesotans. And I think that goes a step further. We need a governor who's willing to speak to that issue. We need a governor who's willing to stand up and say, look, the Minnesota Chamber of Commerce is right. We don't need English-only language classes or restrictions. We need classes that help people become Americans.
Great. Thank you. So Representative Emmer, just to be clear though, if the Minnesota legislature presented you with this law, would you sign it as governor?
Well, I don't think you're going to see that. More importantly, getting back to what Mr. Horner just said, I couldn't disagree with him more. I absolutely do believe, and I think we've just said the same thing. For some reason, I don't know why people want to attack a state like Arizona and judge what they're doing down there, where they've got a serious problem with illegal immigration and people having a serious public safety problem. Those lawmakers, that governor, they're trying to honor their commitment, their constitutional obligation for the public safety of people in Arizona. But that's Arizona. In Minnesota, I think we all just said the same thing. You've got to celebrate the ideal that people are going to keep coming to the state of Minnesota to enjoy the freedom and opportunity that we have. But Mr. Horner, to suggest that we should have all kinds of different languages, we want people to celebrate their culture, their tradition, their history. We want them to maintain that, but we also want them to assimilate into the state of Minnesota and become productive members of our community. And I think English should be our language.
And Representative Emmer, look, if we're going to start to draw lines, then let's go back and look at your real quote. Because what you did say, and it was repeated, is that not just that law was a good first step for Arizona, but you've said, and you repeated, that you wanted that law for Minnesota. And that was the fact check, and we can look it up, and we'll see the full quote in context, bring that law to Minnesota. I fundamentally disagree with that. Do I think that we ought to have everybody speaking English? Of course. But you don't get there by setting laws that say we're going to exclude you from society if you're unable to speak English. You get there by saying we're going to make the investment in bringing you into society, in making English language classes available to people, in doing the right thing, in being a society that doesn't just talk about equality, but goes out and works for it. And that's the role of a governor.
Senator Dayton, your chance to jump in here.
Well, as a public school teacher in New York City, I taught, then it was called English Second Language. Back then we had 4 different languages in the school. In Minnesota now they're told 95 different languages and dialects throughout our state. So yes, I would agree we want to give everyone the opportunity to learn English because they'll be more successful, those facts are, socioeconomically by doing so, and that's why we need to have our education system one that welcomes people from all over the country, all over the world to Minnesota and gives them the opportunity with small classes and individual attention to regain the skills that they need. It's wonderful to go to the Wellstone International School. Paul and Sheila be so proud of that school carrying their name, where kids who came to Minnesota with never having formal education as teenagers are graduating ages 19, 20, 21, 22 years old, having had the opportunity that every child should have in Minnesota, every young adult should have in Minnesota, to realize his or her fullest potential.
Thank you. Moving on to the next question, we'll start here with you, Senator Dayton. The quality of higher education affects Minnesota's workforce, economy, industry, and cultural life, yet state support has been declining. Last week, University of Minnesota officials unveiled a budget proposal requesting $1.3 billion in state funding over the next biennium. It was reported in the Minnesota Daily that University President Bob Brunick said, quote, "If we continue this path of disinvestment, it will be close to impossible to rebuild. The cost of rebuilding, the cost of catching up if we make the wrong calls right now, will be extraordinarily high for the university and for Minnesota." So as governor, what would you do to ensure quality public higher education going forward?
Well, first of all, going back to your very first question, the next governor and legislature will inherit a $5.8 billion deficit. So before you can add additional money for something like the University of Minnesota, however commendable that is, and that would certainly be one of my goals, to have to balance that budget. And also recognize, as we go forward, that if the state fails to make these investments, the result is higher tuition. And that's the reason that tuition at our two-year public colleges is third highest in the nation. Tuition here at the University of Minnesota is 50% higher than the average at the state universities in the surrounding 4 states, 1/3 higher than the next highest, the University of Wisconsin. So we need to recognize, just as President Brunick said, that without the state of Minnesota making these investments, the quality is going to suffer and affordability is going to become worse. I mean, St. Cloud State, University of Minnesota Mankato have cut 14 and 17% of their faculty, respectively, for this coming year. It's devastating, the quality of education that can be offered, and it's very unfair to all of our students who need those opportunities.
Thank you. Mr. Horner.
Well, I think, again, this is another question of leadership. This is another question of how do we get there? Because I think we all would agree that higher education has to be a priority for Minnesota. The challenge is, in the context of a shortfall that is 20% of the state's operating budget, how do we get there? And so next year, look at the opportunity. A new president of the university, a new chancellor of Minnesota State colleges and universities, and a new governor. We need to use that as an opportunity to have a conversation around priorities. What's the outcome we need? And be willing to put everything on the table. Do we need a realignment of systems? How do we protect our great 2-year community and vocational schools? How do we make sure that our 4-year schools are doing what we need of them? Is it the right way to have our 4-year schools offering 300, 400, 500 different majors, or should we go to centers of excellence? And how do we truly make a world-class research university on this campus right here? Set the outcome, have a leader who's going to have the conversation and put everything on the table, then we can decide where and how we fund it.
Thank you. Representative Emmer.
Well, it's time to get past the conversation. It's time to be responsible. Let's face it. You can't fund anything if you don't have the money to fund it. And right now, when we look at higher ed, it absolutely is important to the future of our state. We have the best workforce in the country. It's the envy, perhaps, of the world. And we need to make sure that we continue to do that. But you got to bring the university system into the 21st century as well. We're way too top-heavy on administration. And I hear President Brunick, who's a wonderful guy, talk about how if we don't get all the money we're asking for, we're going to have to raise tuition again. Well, perhaps we should look at some of the administration. Perhaps we should look at how we make this more affordable, because inflation on college campuses is running way beyond what it's going everywhere else. And again, if we're going to talk about honesty, you can't make promises to everybody about everything. You've got to talk to people about what it is you're going to cut when you have a $2.5 billion hole in your budget or you have a $1 billion hole in your budget. We've got to start being responsible so we can fund our priorities going into the future.
Thank you. We'll get back to the issue of funding higher education, but now for a different question about higher education, and here we start with Mr. Horner. If you were asked to give a series of lectures in an undergraduate class here at the University of Minnesota, what subject would you choose, what particular insight would you bring, and what viewpoints other than your own would you include?
Well, I would speak to the issue of leadership, because again, I think that's going to be the critical issue. And so the insights that I would bring are the insights of those people who have been great leaders in Minnesota. Look at Arne Carlson, a former governor whose endorsement I'm very proud to have. Governor Carlson walked into a situation where he had a huge deficit. He fixed it. He fixed it honestly and transparently. But then he turned around and he said, now we need to reform. Now we need to invest. Now we need to build for the future. And he brought together a bipartisan group of legislators and worked on health care reform and did a terrific program. And it took them 2 tries, but he stuck with it. The same thing on workers' comp. Governor Carlson said, we'll fix workers' compensation because it is discouraging job creation in Minnesota. He brought together a bipartisan group of legislators, unions, workers, business people, and they got a solution. That's leadership. If you're not tied to the old solutions of the past, you can move to the future.
Thank you. Representative Emmer?
Well, I'd give a lecture on common sense, but I'd hope it'd be more of a dialogue. Common sense says that you can't keep spending more than you have. Common sense says that you can't just keep spending what you want to spend as opposed to what you need to spend. I'd want to have a dialogue about the fact that we can't continue to grow government beyond its means, and we got to get back to our roots, the freedom that this country's supposed to offer. This country was not built by government. It was built by people, people who had the freedom, more freedom than any other people's ever known on the face of the planet, giving people the freedom and the opportunity to realize their greatest dreams and meet their full potential. That's the discussion that I'd like to have.
Thank you. Senator Dayton.
Well, I agree with Representative Emmer. I would not give a lecture. I'd want to have a dialogue, and it would be about heroes. I'd share who are my heroes, such as Robert Kennedy and Winston Churchill, Franklin Roosevelt, Abraham Lincoln, Betty Jo Ogren, my 3rd and 4th grade teacher who was so crucial in my making a transition from one school to another. And I'd ask the students, who are your heroes? And what are the qualities of leadership, as you said, Mr. Horner, and also just inspiration and just the challenges that they overcame in their lives to make the contributions they did to the betterment of our society, and what kind of inspiration can they offer us in our lives?
Thank you all. You can all come to my class. Switching gears. Question number 8. We're starting here with Representative Emmer. Learning from the successes and failures of one's predecessor is important, and Minnesotans need to know how much change and continuity to expect in the governor's office. As governor, in what ways would you emulate Governor Tim Pawlenty's policy positions and leadership style, and in what ways would you depart from his policy positions and leadership style?
Well, I appreciate the question, but I think we should go back farther than that. I think what I'd like to do is look back at how we got here. Because it's one thing to look backward and try to assess blame, which other people seem to want to do on a regular basis, to say it's their fault or it's his or her fault as to how we got here. But we got to start looking forward, and the only reason we should look backward is to see how we got here. And how did we get here? Since the late 60s, early 70s, we've had a model of governance in this state where Republicans, Democrats alike, or even people who call themselves other, have always had this idea that when government runs out of money, it looks immediately to the hardworking men and women of the state, to the business of this state, and tells them just to pay some more. So government continues to grow. That's not the answer for the future. Government in this state has simply grown to be too large today. It is suffocating our private economy. You got to get that balance back, and the leadership, the style that I would offer is it's about all of us. It's not just some of us. We've got to get Minnesota back on track, and we're going to all have to work together to do that.
Senator Dayton, Governor Pawlenty's policies and style.
Well, I appreciate and I would emulate Governor Pawlenty's support for the Minnesota Department of Veterans Affairs. I respect his commitment to our troops serving. He's been to Iraq, I believe to Afghanistan, as I went when I was a senator 3 times to Iraq, once to Afghanistan, and we both did together the hard part of it, which is to go to, in my case most, I think in his case virtually all, of the wakes and funerals of the heroes who died in the service to their country in those countries, and I was grateful to him that often he'd give me an opportunity to fly the National Guard helicopter to get there and back expeditiously, and that's hard to do, and I respect his commitment, and Mrs. Pawlenty's to that as well. I disagree that Governor Pawlenty shifted the tax burden to the property tax. Property taxes, as I said earlier, have gone up from $4 billion to $7 billion during his 2 terms. That's a tax that falls unfairly on middle-income taxpayers and on small businesses. So I would reverse that and put the tax responsibility more on upper income and the income tax and protect the middle class.
Thank you. Mr. Horner.
I think a couple of things that Governor Pawlenty has done well is that in his first administration, I think he was much more responsible in dealing honestly and forthrightly with the budget, including some tax increases, to balance the budget, focus on spending cuts, but do the right thing. I think Governor Pawlenty has done a pretty good job in setting a foundation for health reform, particularly for his investments in prevention. But let me tell you a couple of things that I do disagree with, and they are about style, and they are about leadership, and they do reflect the candidates up here. One is that I think we have a $6 billion deficit to deal with next year because Representative Emmer, Governor Pawlenty, Democrats, Republicans weren't willing to deal with a $3 billion shortfall this year. We can't afford that. And so my promise to you is that at the end of 4 years, I'll hand over a truly balanced budget. But I think secondly, Governor Pawlenty, with his ambitions for higher office, I think Senator Dayton, frankly, it does reflect your career of always trying to move on to the next office, giving up on what you've done before the job is over. We can't afford that. We've seen the consequences in Minnesota.
Okay, we're running short on time here, but only Representative Emmer, if you could follow up for about 30 seconds and tell us, is there anything about Governor Pawlenty's policy positions that you disagree with?
Well, here's the thing. I mean, we have Senator Dayton talking about how there's this direct relationship to property taxes, as if somehow the budget was cut over the last 8 years, and Mr. Horner suggesting the same thing, and that it's terrible because it's pushing it on. Ladies and gentlemen, a fact. At the end of this biennium, from 2001 to the end of 2011, the end of this biennium, state government general fund spending will have grown by almost $6.5 billion. It hasn't gone down under Governor Pawlenty. It's gone up by almost $6.5 billion. So this argument about property taxes is not right, and we'll just leave it at that.
Okay, this is our final question for our television and radio audience. And because of time limits, we're just going to take 45 seconds each. I apologize. What are your top goals for your first term? And if, like Governors Pawlenty and Carlson, you have a second term, what would you like to have accomplished by the end of that term? There will be no follow-up. And Senator Dayton, you're first.
Well, I'd roll up my sleeves and go to work to put Minnesotans back to work all over the state. I'll go anywhere in the state or nation or world where there's a job to be gained for Minnesota. And I'd make government a proactive partner with businesses throughout Minnesota, with mayors and chambers and local development corporations, as I did when I was Commissioner of Economic Development. And then I would, as the dollars that come with improved economy and those resources are available, make my priority commitment to education, starting with early childhood education, smaller class sizes, optional all-day kindergarten, higher education that's more affordable, restore the cuts that have been made at faculty and options here at the University of Minnesota in the MnSCU system. And the second term, I'd just do more of the same. I'd try to help put more people back to work throughout Minnesota and restore Minnesota once as the premier state in the nation.
Thank you, Senator Dayton. Mr. Horner.
Well, first and foremost, we have to balance the budget. We have to do it honestly, fairly. We have to do it in a way that still allows for investment in Minnesota's future. Secondly, I do think that we need to have a conversation around health, around education, so that we can start to make changes. We need to let teachers teach. We need to remove some of the rigidity of schools. We need to look at education as a seamless, lifelong opportunity, and that is going to include early education, reforming K-12, looking at higher education. Long term, we do have to reform health care. We've got to get control of the costs. That's going to include older adult services as well as the current health care system, and make it work for everybody by starting to deal with it as a community level issue. And in the end, we need to be a state that is open for everybody, that creates opportunity and jobs for all Minnesotans.
Thank you. Representative Emmer.
Well, what I propose to do is exactly what I'm the only one who's put out there, a balanced budget. A budget that is not smaller than it is right now. It's 7 to 8% greater. So to suggest it's a cut, it's not. Government is going to grow in the next biennium, if we're in the office, by 7 to 8%. And we will redesign the actual structure of government to get rid of the bloat, the duplication, the excess, so that we can start to deliver services that people expect in an efficient manner. And then first and foremost, the thing that you don't hear from my colleagues that we must do is the next governor, the next legislature must get government out of the way and create new opportunities to grow jobs in this state. Because if we don't start growing jobs again in our private economy, it won't matter. We won't have the revenue to pay for the services people expect out of government. That should be the job of the next governor.
Thank you. This concludes the first segment of the debate for our television and radio audience. Please join me in thanking the three candidates.
Thank you.